I want to begin with the artist statement and a little bit of a background around in Kashmir. You write that poetry spurts at the frontier where the gaze of stark prose is constricted by barbed wire, and that poetry does not merely archive, it makes one a witness. You had already written the prose Resisting Disappearance. It's 400 pages. What could poems say that the ethnography could not?
Thank you so much for this question. So I think the ethnography is people's voices that I rendered, and I wanted to stay true to what they were saying on ground. And that's what ethnography is. It's deep listening, even though anthropology does have colonial roots, and we have to pay attention to that as well. But in the current moment, the kind of decolonial ethnography or decolonial anthropology that we try to practice, that kind of rendered the voices of these activists, women, mothers, families, and in this network of people, what was emerging through them about the disappearances, the enforced disappearances of more than 10,000 men, who are mostly Kashmiri men. There are children as well, and that is documented too. So there is the grounded ethnography, which is staying very true to what you find on ground and true within the purview of academia as well, even though it is written in a very accessible ethnographic format, which is a form of storytelling. That's what it is. It's the stories of people that have not been seen as genuine stakeholders. So resisting disappearance essentially is a grounded ethnography. It is the voices of people. It is the voices of these activists, these mothers who started the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons. It was Parveena Ahangar who co-founded it in 1994 with Pervez Imroz, who is a human rights lawyer and a human rights activist. They co-founded it, and they also won a couple of awards together. And in that idiom, the work that I was doing, this was wholly and solely trying to stay grounded within the voices and narratives of these activists. And many of them are mothers. Many of them are what you call as half widows, meaning the husbands have disappeared and they don't know whether they're dead or alive. This was a term that was given to them by the local English media, and that's how they have been known in the last 35 plus years. So these are 10,000 disappearances. So it was a huge responsibility to talk about not just the human rights issue, but what does this human rights violation say about what Kashmiris are living under? Because that also questions the very fabric of what you call the democracy that India is. So it questions that. It also takes you way back into history. Like, what exactly is Kashmir and why is there so much dissent and why is there so much resistance, whether that be discursive resistance or whether that be the armed resistance. So that's the grounded ethnography part. But then and it does the work of listening, and it also does the work of rendering that listening as much as possible and as authentically as possible. That's humanly possible. So, but also being a poet, there was this other side to my work where I was rendering most of the things as an ethnographer who was trying to stay very boxed within what academia gives you a leeway for and trying to do the work of grounded ethnography. But at the same time, I did want, because I'm a poet, or I like to, I think I'm a poet. So I also rendered it simultaneously into poetry because I think as a Kashmiri, it was also a space for me to what I called, this was like there was this surfeit of emotion and affect that was happening when you do this kind of work, when you are with the families, because you do participant observation and it's a 10-year project that culminated in 2019 and it started in 2007, 2008. So it was a 10-year long journey with the APDP, with Parveena Ahangar, with other activists and mothers and families and people who are associated with APDP and people who are not associated with APDP but have had disappearances in their families, have had different kinds of human rights violations. So there's a plethora of human rights violations that have happened in the last 70 plus years, and which had been stepped up after 1989. So enforced disappearance is just one of them. But it was also very unique for the society because suddenly people are disappearing. That was the 90s. Someone would leave in the morning and not return. So it also became this open wound and the society did not really know what to do with it. Whether do you do a funeral for the disappeared or do you just wait for them. And that's the work of mourning. Slowly and steadily it culminated in this movement, and also it culminated in a politics of mourning, because you could not do active politics inside Kashmir. You cannot be an active dissident. You don't have freedom of expression. So APDP was very unique in creating this politics of mourning, and mourning like regular protests where they would monthly or twice monthly, whenever, commemorating various days, they would sit in a public plaza, and that's where they would have this protest, which also looked like a funeral, and where there would be traditional funeral songs that the women would sing. And it wasn't a free protest. They were surveilled heavily, and there was a lot of humiliation and beatings and imprisonment around that, which is a separate story. So all of that was happening, and this was a 10-year-long engagement with this movement, which sadly right now is under deep surveillance, and they cannot protest anymore. And the poetry was the other side of it. I think poetry was my personal space of catharsis, but then it also gave expression to things that I wanted to make connections with within the politics as well. And that's what you see in Kashmir, writing under occupation. It's also there's like a little bit of a personal journey, but it's also about all the symbolics of occupation that Kashmir presents and represents to its people, but also to the outside world. And that's what In Kashmir is, the poetry book.
Really appreciate that, because in the same statement, you write that the killable body of Kashmiris is afflicted with an active forgetting in order to survive. And the poems seem to work against that. A day in the life that inches prayer by prayer. That's on page 32 to 34 from In Kashmir. It measures out one ordinary day in 5 prayers, and no one is killed in it. What is the labor of that forgetting, and is the poem a way of refusing it?
I think my entire work is a refusal to forget what Kashmiris have gone through historically and what they're going through in this moment. And that poem represents a day in a life of a Kashmiri. And because many of them are Muslims, and what has been happening in the last 70 plus years under the Indian occupation, most of Kashmiri life is so heavily surveilled. And there are different kinds of human rights violations that occur. But I would say the most profound and deeply felt is the humiliation that happens on Kashmiri streets every day. When Kashmiris, being from the homeland, being from that soil, being from that earth, are not allowed to freely move without their identity cards, without being stopped, without being asked where they're going, without them having to prove loyalty, whatever that means. So that poem is a reflection of that. It is again, it's a refusal to forget, because there is an imposed forgetting. Censorship is also a form of forgetting. It's asking people to not write. It's asking people to edit out what they would have wanted to record for posterity. So that is happening in this moment. We know that censorship has always been part and parcel of Kashmiri life. There's never been a time when Kashmiris have been able to express freely in different measures, I want to say. There was a time in the 2000s when a lot of intellectual and lot of, creative output was being delivered by Kashmiris and offered to their own society and outside as well. It was called the Kashmiri Intifada because there were films, there were poetry, there was graffiti, there was different kinds of, novels that have been written and that are quite famous and reputed. But now, and slowly and steadily, what has been happening is that the censorship has gotten so deep that in 2022, there was a law that was passed. It's actually called a media gag. And according to that, there's so much surveillance of what can be reported from on ground, unless and until it doesn't put India in a positive light, any kind of coverage doesn't get a green signal. And journalists are de-empaneled, their media portals, their newspapers, they are demonetized, and different kinds of penalizations are done. And to top it all, journalists are also incarcerated. They're also labeled as terrorists and then thrown into jail. Obviously, they're not, nothing is proven later on, and many of them have been released, but many of them are still in jails. And that happens to human rights activists as well. There is hardly any documentation of human rights violations happening in the last 5-6 years because human rights defenders are also in jails. And when you think about the movement that I was working with, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, they have been raided. They have been there are two APDPs, and Khurram Parvez, who heads one, he's in jail since the last 4 years. And the other APDP, which is headed by Parveena Ahangar, the activist mother, she is under surveillance and she has been raided, and these offices are de facto closed. So that is the moment that we are living in, witnessing Kashmir, so to speak. So I think there is this movement to make everything kind of silent inside Kashmir by the Indian government. And this is a silencing that I don't think Kashmiris are silent, so to speak. They have been silenced. It's the silence of a graveyard, as one of the Kashmiris very recently in one of the interviews, they put it. And I do think it's not the absence of dissent as much as it is the repression of whatever form of expression people can have. As little as an emoticon, as little as a social media post that alludes to something that the Indian government has done. So every kind of dissent, be that big or small, every kind of freedom of expression that shows Kashmiri political history in its correct form, that shows political desire of Kashmiris, is all of that is under repression at the moment, and the freedom of expression is de facto gone.
I just wanted to add that your Global Voices piece on Khurram Parvez, you spell out how SPA has worked and the prosecution, the way it's occurred, in terms of government sanction. And then in over 30 years, not one member of the Indian forces has been tried in a civilian court. In 2023, a tribunal suspended the life sentence of a captain convicted over a staged killing. When you write lawfare, what exactly is the law doing in this situation?
So when we think about law in Kashmir, it's not been the mode of ideal law, as much as it has been to impose some form of order and some form of capitulation from people. And by lawfare, just like the regular definition that it is, I do mean when law is deployed as a weapon against people to repress them. And that's what we see in Kashmir. So the Armed Forces Special Powers Act that was enacted and implemented somewhere in the 1990s, I think 1991, right after the armed struggle, that gives the army a free rein in the region. It's technically a military rule. So they are the ones who are deciding and in this moment, what you think about when you think about Kashmir after 2019, any area can be considered as a strategic area and people can be thrown out of that place. And that has happened in a couple of places. And that has also right now, if you think about how much land is under the army and other forces, it's the size of Dallas. And Kashmir is not that big a place. So when we look at Kashmir in this moment, there are laws, and I always like to give this analogy of a bird cage. Like when you look at a Kashmiri or a Kashmiri life, it's inside a bird cage, and they're the bars. They represent each mode of penalization that happens and is imposed upon people. So lawfare is one of them. Bureaucracy is another, because there are laws that are passed. There is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. There is the Disturbed Areas Act. Then there is the UAPA, which is also prevalent in the most penalizing form on Kashmiris. You can see that many of the Kashmiris, once they go through the rigors of being imprisoned for years on end, they usually acquitted. But there is more than 75%. I am not exactly sure of the statistics, but many of the people, I think it's more than 90% of people are acquitted, but that it takes years of their life. So it's almost like the process is the punishment itself. Then, so lawfare. Then there you have bureaucracy. You very recently also saw when the Dominion law was changed after the removal of autonomy in 2019. And removal of autonomy was a huge rupture in a way that now the New Delhi could directly govern the region, which has not happened for the first time, by the way. But the region was demoted from state to a union territory. The autonomy was removed militarily, unilaterally, without asking people. And Kashmiris used to be permanent residents of Kashmir, which meant that they had a special status as permanent residents. Their rights, their indigenous rights were protected. They had right to franchise, right to property. But soon after, what happens is that there are no more permanent residents. And that because of the removal of autonomy, now it's been added to India as one of its states. Not even a state. It's been demoted to a union territory to be ruled by a nominated official from the current government that is in power in New Delhi. So what that also does is there's a deep humiliation that has happened and a deep demotion of Kashmiris culturally, intellectually, and slowly and steadily we are at a moment when no one can talk freely. If the Indian government likes to talk about, when the Indian government talks about normalization, I think, and also the streets being quiet and people being quiet, I think we need to question, like, how is it possible that the streets can be so quiet, people can be so quiet that there's not even a whisper of dissent? How does this democracy exist? Because I think dissent is the juice of any democracy. And that's not what's prevalent inside Kashmir right now. It's out and out repression. It's a military occupation. And after 2019, it's brazenly settler colonial. That is not to say it was not colonial before, but settler colonialism has its modes and it kind of like transforms and shapes. And I think we are in the moment where people are actively being dispossessed, and even from the land that they live on.
In Resisting Disappearance, you read Afzal Guru's hanging in the Supreme Court's own words to satisfy the collective conscience of the nation. He was killed by the law, not outside of it. And since 2019, we've seen like the state hold elections and, restored statehood be part of the conversation. What is democracy doing when it needs a killable Kashmiri in the Indian context?
So the answer to this question is like twofold. One is that it forces us to think about nation-state system itself, which was imposed on most of the world in 1940s, and it was in the idiom and template of Westphalian nation-states, and we kind of are following a settler nation-state system in India. When we look at Kashmir through that lens, if we think about America being a democracy, but it is on the foundational violence of a settler state that it has been, and slowly and steadily it kind of like is seen also as progressive because of the different things that it did, like it abolished slavery and then civil rights and all of that it has become progressive over time. But the foundation is settler colonial. And this is the template of nation state systems. And I'm not making it black and white. There are different forms that have been implemented all across the world, but the basis of this nation state system is very violent. So one is that we have to think about that in a parallel manner. And the other is that India proposes and propagates that it's a democracy. And we do want to ask the question, like, how is it possible that a democracy can hang a person without due process? And that is not just Afzal Guru. That has also happened to Maqbul Bhatt. What exactly happened in Afzal Guru's case was that he was a militant and then he surrendered. He did not want to continue with militancy anymore. But he was already marked because he was also picked up by the counter-insurgency grid. And then they kind of deployed and weaponized him in different ways. And he ends up being convicted, not convicted. He ends up being accused of this attack that happened on the Indian parliament. And it took, I think, a decade. In that decade, he was painted as this oppressive Muslim terrorist. And I think initially when he was caught, and I've written about this, when he was arrested, he was wearing just a Western style trousers and shirt, and he did not have a beard. But I think being incarcerated, he probably because, being incarcerated and being under such pressures, he had started wearing kurta pajama, which is the long tunic and trousers. And then he would also wear a shawl or a scarf around his head, and he kept a beard. And that was the picture that was circulated during that one decade with the news around. It was a media trial that happened right from the get-go. And in the morning of February 9th, when he was hanged, his family doesn't know. They had actually petitioned for amnesty and they were still waiting for that. His personal effects were not sent to them. And when he was hanged as per the Supreme Court judgment, said that it was to assuage or for the collective conscience of Indian nation, because it was basically baying for blood. And Kashmiri body has become killable. It brings the Indian nation state together, because it's a body that is kind of seen doubly outcast. It's not just Muslim, but it's also Kashmiri. And Kashmiris, you only have to look at a few Bollywood pictures to think about movies. You have to see what they think of Kashmiris. And this is not just in the last 30 years. You can go back to even early 90s with this film called Roja, which is cinematically seen as a masterpiece. But it demonizes Kashmiris. And even if you go back to the 60s, it's not as if they have been kind. It's almost like through this colonial gaze where they see Kashmiris as servile people who only have to pander to tourists. And, it's in that idiom that Kashmiris have been seen right from the get-go. And in this moment, the demonization is complete. And I know that now in the whole subcontinent, and when we have kind of seen what's been happening in the last 10, 15 years within India, the demonization of Muslims at large, and that kind of makes Kashmiris as doubly outcasts.